Hello friends, my name is Marines, and these are the 8 worst books that I read in 2024. Number 8 is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is an adult paranormal romance, and it follows Misery Lark, who is a hacker vampire, and she is forced into a marriage of convenience with Lo, who is the alpha of the werewolf pack. She agrees to this marriage and to this alliance because she has her own secret agenda as she is investigating the disappearance of her best friend. I've had a really interesting journey with my Ali Hazelwood reading. I mean, I've only read 3, I think, of her books, and I enjoyed The Love Hypothesis, and I hated Love on the Brain. And so with Bride, I was cautiously optimistic because there was a way that I thought maybe some of her goofiness would translate well into paranormal romance, where there is like a suspended disbelief where some of that soapiness might fit better than like in a workplace, for instance. Unfortunately, that's not how this ended up working. I don't think that this was actually very interested in its paranormal elements. The paranormal elements here seem to just sort of exist at the basic level of a premise of like, hey, we've got vampires and werewolves, and being very narrowly interested in how that interacted with the story. So like anatomy, obviously, it was like a big thing that this was interested in, but not like lore or consistency. It left all of these elements feeling a little bit like unmoored. And maybe it would have been okay if that was happening, but it was like an amazing romance full of chemistry, but I didn't think it was either. First, because I felt like each of the characters in this were pretty flat. Misery is just a vampire version of every other Ali Hazelwood protagonist. We are told over and over that she is very highly competent in one area, right? So this isn't like one of the STEMinist ones where she's a scientist or whatever, but she's a vampire and also a hacker for some reason, because this feels like really central to the things that Ali Hazelwood builds, is like this hyper competent female main character. But the thing is that it's often more telling than showing in her actions and what we're actually watching Misery do. She is absolutely undercutting that narrative. As a hacker, as somebody who should be good at computers or reasoning things out or anything along those lines, it felt like Misery was just oblivious the entire time. And because there is this like mystery that is ultimately maybe not the plot engine, because that is absolutely the romance, but it is what is like bringing the plot along while the romance is developing, that there was just no intrigue here whatsoever, mostly because Misery refused to connect a single dot. In a story where you're asked to suspend disbelief because it's vampires and werewolves and all of that, the things I found the most unbelievable were actually every single decision that Misery made. This obliviousness also becomes like the crux of the romance itself. That is the entire dynamic here, is that this woman is completely oblivious about this man who is very clearly like pining for her and interested in her, but she's la-la-laing through the entire book. And that's not necessarily a dynamic I enjoy like out the gate, but had this been stronger in other elements like the world or the characterization, that would not have bothered me as much as it did here, where it feels like the entire plot is Misery Lark doesn't notice a thing and somehow she still falls in love. That flatness in the character is not exclusive to Misery, who is actually like the better of the two characters as the point of view character, because Lo is largely so plain. He is so nothing in this story. Ali Hazelwood tends to love these like wooden block characters for men, showing us that they're very stoic, but in practice that comes off as them just like feeling super bland and not having much about their characters. And ultimately, because we have these two flat characterizations, it didn't feel like there was a lot of chemistry to me between them in the romance. We get these epigraphs throughout that are from the point of view of Lo, which in theory is like really fun to just have these glimpses as Misery is like, I think he hates me, to get the epigraphs where he's like, oh my God, I love her. Like in theory, that sounds really fun, but I think what it actually ended up doing is highlighting how removed Lo is from the main narrative, that we keep getting reminded in these flashes of his point of view that like he's even there. And they're like, oh yeah, that guy. Like to me, it just was pointing attention to the fact that you needed the epigraphs because that was how empty the story felt of this entire character. Another thing with Ali Hazelwood works is just that quirkiness, right? Her humor. It just is a matter of like whether the goofiness of her humor is going to land for you. And here in Bride, it did not land for me. Being in Misery's head and hearing her constant like little quips and jokes felt mortifying to me in a lot of ways. My favorite example of this, I probably said this in my like main review when I did it, but we get this conversation between Misery and Lo where she's like, I don't use a washcloth and Lo does. And I'm just like, why is this happening? Like, why is this happening, period? A lot of the conversations and things that were happening, I had that like sense of like, I don't understand why we're doing this in the first place. But then on top of that, especially in a paranormal romance, it just felt really tonally dissonant. So overall, the story's reliance on the miscommunication, on the obliviousness, on the overdone sort of quirky humor, it really became exhausting for me. The writing itself was fine. It was clean, it is competent, it's not funny, it's not interesting, it's not romantic, and not even the tee-hee-hee of nodding could save this one. Number 7 is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This is a fantasy about a character named Elspeth who shares her mind with a spirit called the Nightmare. In this world, the magic system has to do with these cards that are collected and wielded. So our main character gets involved in this plot to collect these cards after she has an encounter with this highwayman. And so it's like a lot of like danger, dark magic, and this dangerous spirit in her head. I went back and forth in this ranking on like whether Bride or One Dark Window was worse. This was actually a conversation that we had multiple times in my Discord about whether Bride or One Dark Window was worse. And like ultimately, I think I put One Dark Window as worse than Bride because the reading experience was worse to me. There was a way that like the writing itself in Bride was more palatable and digestible than I found it in One Dark Window. Like if you told me right now that I had to reread one of these books, I would pick Bride over One Dark Window. A lot of my complaints about the books on this list are going to be similar for obvious reasons, but this is another book where I felt like the world building felt super flat. The idea of the cards and the magic system was very interesting, but I didn't feel like there was any sort of scope of the world beyond the necessity of the plot. There are some books that you read that feel sort of empty, and here we are dealing with the politics and the magic of the wider world, but there wasn't really that depth to the world building here. Instead of world building, the thing that we truly sort of focus on here is atmosphere, which atmosphere is not a replacement for world building, and the atmosphere here was done in a very ham-fisted way. It was just a lot of repetition about like the fog and the fog and the fog and the grayness and the mist. It was a very foggy, misty atmosphere, and that seemed to be like the prevailing thing that we were leading with. Like it was like the frosting, but when you went to cut into it, there was no cake. Elspeth is another protagonist that is just absolutely allergic to connecting a single dot. Like the way that from go, you hear about the nightmare in her head and then start reading what's happening in the story and go, oh, so this? And she just refuses to make that connection for hundreds of pages. I hate stories where I feel that far ahead of the main character. I can be ahead of the main character, and that can be really satisfying when you start to see things come together. But when you're that far ahead of the main character for literally hundreds of pages, it then becomes a really sort of insufferable reading experience. And the thing that I had the biggest issue here was the writing itself, because all of these issues are compounded by the fact that the writing is so repetitive. We got these constant descriptions of the characters' faces and expressions, but then even in the language, it felt really repetitive because this is one of those books where all of the characters were just using each other's names really unnaturally in dialogue, but all of the names were also trees. So it's just like trees constantly, tree names, and then like face descriptions and then fog. And I kept going and going. And then on top of that, you had the fact that the nightmare only speaks in rhymes. It became so irritating to me, especially because that is like the kind of thing that I would find interesting, or that could be like really poetic and beautiful in the middle of the book. But the simplicity of the rhymes and how much they were used within the story instead became sort of like this irritating rhythm within the work. The romantic relationship here is a key portion of this, but I just felt like we were like not actually watching their relationship progress. This is like a huge complaint that I have about a lot of romantasy and romance right now, is that like we've lost the art of showing the relationship development. And here it just felt really patchy in terms of like showing how these characters were interacting or why their feelings towards each other would be changing or growing or building. I was really surprised by how bad this one was, especially considering how hyped it is. I found it really tonally inconsistent, badly written, very repetitive, anachronistic, very shallow in its atmosphere building and almost non-existent in its world building. And then you get a romance that was hardly developed. Number 6 is A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. This is a fantasy story about an architectural student named Effie who wins a contest in order to redesign the home of her favorite author. And of course, when she gets there, she finds that things are not as they appear, and she has to team up with the other student, the literature student who is there, in order to uncover what exactly is happening at this manor. This is my first Ava Reid. Despite where this is in the ranking here, in terms of like not being the worst of my worst, I think that this was one of the books on this list that actually made me the most angry. There was a way that Bride and One Dark Window were not trying really to say anything, and that's fine. Not every book has to have like this thing that it's attempting to say, but A Study in Drowning was actually trying to explore all of these themes about misogyny and trauma and prejudice, and it was just doing so very badly. I think the thing that tipped me over into being really angry about what I was reading is that we were in the head and following this character who was incredibly prejudiced against her love interest. Effie is from one place and her love interest Preston is from another. These two countries, nations, whatever, are in conflict with each other. I'm not explaining this well, but to be clear, it is because I don't think that the story did a good enough job in helping us understand what the history and the dynamic here was. Like, we were told more about the dynamic from the perspective of Effie being incredibly prejudiced against this man. And this is not a case where like this is a flaw of the characters and we're seeing this and then there's like some messaging that we see that is countered, or there's some arc of her like unpacking or unlearning this. The thing we actually watch happen is that she is really bigoted and then she falls in love. And I don't know if the implication is that like falling in love solved her bigotry, but that's not how that works. And I don't understand how we were supposed to be invested in the romance if like much of what we are watching her do is disparage this man based on his country of origin. Like, I don't, like, how is that a basis for me, the reader, to be invested in what you are telling me or trying to sell to me as a love story? I actually did not like this woman. I found it really hard to invest in this protagonist because of her very bigoted ideas. And then by the end, when they are not countered in any meaningful way, meant that the book like never recovered from that. With some of the other sort of conversations that this was trying to have about like misogyny and gendered violence, I just felt like it was a little bit muddled. I mean, throughout the book, she is sexually harassed by pretty much every male character that shows up on the page, except for maybe the love interest. And there is a way that all of that is tied to the idea that she is very beautiful. And it might be that Reid thought she was exploring something about beauty and the expectations of beauty. The way that it came across to me felt too muddy to be making that point, because there was such a strong tie to the idea of beauty and harassment that this is why she was being harassed, so as to again make this just really uncomfortable to read. I found her presence as a protagonist to also be like a little sort of erratic in terms of her decision making. This is another character that I just couldn't like follow what they were doing and why they were doing it. Preston was fine, I guess, but this is another example of a forgettable main male character and a pretty empty romantic relationship. The entire premise of the story felt ridiculous to me in a way that I just could never get over, because we were constantly being reminded of why Effie like was in this place. Making Effie an architecture student because only men got to be literature students and literature was what she really wanted to do, and her just being like, well, I guess I'll do architecture. All of that felt so silly to me, and you can tell that the author author just didn't really care to like look into or explore or understand or communicate what she knew about architecture, because it's just like, I guess I'll do some drawing. It was so weird. And so the idea that she's like failing architecture, but she wins this contest and she gets taken to this manor, right? We learned like why that setup is that way, which is fine. But the idea that this character would never question this, that she would just show up at this place and hardly ever talk about architecture, that every couple business days someone would just go, so how are the plans? And she went, they're coming along. And that was it. It just felt so flimsy, especially when she could have just made this woman a literature student, one of the only women in the program, and like sent her off to do this research on this author with a better like reason to even be there. And then you could have an actual like rivals to lovers sort of situation here, because it's like sort of positioned as a rivals to lovers. But like Preston is a literature student, she's an architecture student. They're not really competing for anything. This is a very one-sided rivalry on Effie's part, where she just kind of like hates his presence because, I don't know, she's a bigot. This felt so interested in the trope without sort of like justifying or building it at all. The writing style itself was initially atmospheric, but then it fell into like the same trap of just mostly being about like fog and prioritizing the fog over the world building. This is definitely a work that was interested in aesthetic over sense of any kind. Like it just really wanted to do the gothic vibe, and a vibes book is fine, I guess, but you can also do that well. And I feel like this just fell into the rut of repetition. I didn't like what any of the resolutions contributed to what this book was trying to ultimately say, especially in the sense at the end that I got. It was like, and that's how I solved misogyny with the help of a man. And just all of the like things that were happening to get us to the climax and resolution all felt a little sort of contrived and silly in ways. This book left me feeling gross about its entire point of view. And then on top of that, I thought it was just overwritten, overwrought, and overinvested in its own aesthetic. Number 5 is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. What is this book about? I'm looking at the description for this book and I'm like, eh? This is a fantasy romance about an assassin named Reid who is caught and is going to be executed, but she is ultimately saved by this king named Khan, who she's always had a bad opinion of. And then their fates collide and intertwine in this world where dragons, when they die, go into the sky and become moons. And sometimes these moons crash to Earth, and Khan is on this quest to find a moon shard. Did I do it? Who can say? This is such an interesting case study in terms of like works that really, really needed to be edited. And I say that recognizing that this book had potential in a lot of ways. I think that there were elements of the world that were super interesting. And unlike every other book that I've already mentioned on this list, this was a work that was very invested in its world building. And you can tell that the author has thought extensively about the world and the politics and like how all of these elements of her world would interact with each other, and where her protagonists would sit within these politics and like what they would think about the world. And the world did feel expansive. There was an investment here in all of its elements that was just unfortunately bogged down by too many words. This needed an editor so bad. I think especially because Parker is trying for this really poetic, like flowery style. And she needed somebody to be like, hey girl, you use this word and I don't think it means what you think it means. Or like you use the thesaurus for this word, but you could just use the word that you intended. Because while this is a similar word, it does not totally mean what you want it to mean. And so it has become clunky. Or like, hey girl, what does this description mean? Because that description doesn't actually make any sense. Like there were so many moments of that it felt like picking through mud to get to the pieces of the character or the lore or the world building that were actually interesting. This is the book where the like main character, maybe for reasons that we will eventually learn why this is the case, but that from like a reading perspective and a reading experience, this was so annoying to me. She had an internal lake that she referenced often. As far as we know, this is just like an internal thing that she does or like references when she's having emotions. So she'll be like, I go to my internal lake and I cry. Jesus. And then every time this godforsaken internal lake was mentioned, especially because every time it was mentioned, it was like progressively more involved. Like she would go to her internal lake and she would throw the emotions to the bottom of her internal lake. It just kept building into this really nonsensical thing. I honestly, if you just removed every mention of the internal lake from this book, I think you could have not only saved yourself like some pages you really needed to delete, but that like overall the reading experience would have just been better. I think the other thing that this needed was to firm up its plot. Like I just sat here for so long looking at the description of the book and trying to pull through my memories of like what actually happened in this book. And I read this really recently. This is not like a January book. This is like a couple weeks ago I read this book, and I was looking at the description and trying to figure out like how any of this happened in the book. But the thing is that this felt like a like collection of like these side quests that the main character was going on. It didn't have a cohesive plot running through it. It didn't feel like we had something that we were really pointed towards, and so it loses a lot of momentum in a book that is over 700 pages. If you have everything feeling like tacked on or like side quests, I think that is a really clear indication that you don't actually understand like the major plot beats of your story and where it is headed. You guys know that fashion advice that is like, before you leave the house, take off one accessory sort of thing? I feel like this book needed the advice, but instead of taking out one thing, I honestly feel like it could have taken out 2 to 3 things. And whether that was like bits of world lore, we didn't need all of it. We didn't need all of it in this one book, especially because there was so little payoff here. And I understand that this is a series and you could get payoff later, but as a single entity, there had to be more instances of being able to follow thoughts to their conclusions or plots to their conclusions, or understand why we were getting the pieces of the story that we were getting here. The author also had a tendency to use like punctuation or repetition for emphasis. Like she was often like dotting us to death, or like saying something and then saying something again in order to really hammer home sort of like the seriousness of it. And I think in combination with this being overly long and then a lot of her other writing sort of missing meaning, it just didn't create like a very readable or cohesive reading experience. A lot of this book just feels cluttered. As far as the characters, for the main female character Reid, I felt like we had a little bit of a disconnect between what we are told her character is and then every other action that she has kind of post that opening, post showing us her as a badass assassin. And I think a lot of that early characterization was very ham-fisted. The writing itself was very in your face in terms of the violence and gore, as if it was like really trying to convince you that this was a like badass assassin. It just felt very unnatural, especially with the way that that drops off and we just see her losing a lot of agency. And so you start to question where all of that energy is as this continues to go on. Reid is, I think, an entry into the ambiguously described man of color that Romantasy has a problem with. If I recall correctly, I found at least one description of his skin being a little bit darker. He feels very much like if Rhysand from Sarah J. Maas's work and Khal Drogo from Game of Thrones like had a character baby, it would be this man. And so what we get a lot of are all of these tropes that are used to portray men of color as sort of violent and savage and over-sexualized. All of that fits in here. Is this a man of color? I don't know. The way he's described is incredibly ambiguous throughout, so there's no way to really tell. But like that is kind of the point of this trope as well in Romantasy, is that we often get these men who are coded as men of color through racist tropes and stereotypes, but they are never explicitly sort of described as men of color, or they're always sort of described right on the border. This book had some moments where I was enjoying it more than others, but I think it is so high on my list of worst because it just was so bloated. It was so bloated, it needed editing so bad. Every other entry that I've complained about that has been repetitive or could have used tightening or whatever, it pales in comparison to the rambling and directionlessness of this work. Number 4 is The House at Watch Hill by Karen Marie Moning. This is a gothic paranormal mystery romance-ish about a character named Zell Grey. She inherits a house and a massive fortune in this small town in Louisiana, but only if she can manage to live in the house for 3 years. Of course, when she gets there, she has to start to unravel the secrets of this manor. When I was looking at all of my like 1 and 2 star ratings to do this list, I looked at this book and I was like, I read that. I know that I read that. And yet not a single memory of this book existed in my head. I had to sit down and really dive into the description and my notes and other reviews to remind me at all what happened in this book. And as I did, I was like, oh, and this is not a me problem. This is not because I did not pay attention. It is because this book is a bunch of nothing. The plot barely advances at over 500 pages. And then we get a cliffhanger at the end of those 500 pages. It spends all of its time hinting at mysteries and introducing threads so that this feels like a 500 plus page prologue instead of a book. The entire thing is just watching this character like avoid everything in front of her, avoid asking questions, avoid making connections, avoid the evidence before her own eyes. Like there is a sense she's like, magic doesn't exist in this whole thing, but there's only so much your character can be disbelieving before it starts to get wearing on the reader, especially when you hit the point where it's like evidence before their own eyes, because to go beyond that is to become obtuse. And I think that in this case, that is something that went against everything else that we've been told about this character. And it also just like kind of isn't fun after a while to just watch somebody go, nuh-uh, like constantly. And again, it isn't that she moves into this house and then starts to see supernatural things. Like before she even gets there, she has been like seeing ghosts and like intuiting people's thoughts like her whole life. She has had this sense that there's something different about her for her whole life. And then she inherits a magical manor, and yet still in the story, she's like, but Matt, this can't be real. And it just went on for entirely way too long. Her inner monologue bothered me personally. It was like full of this like pseudo intellectual, like pseudo wise, like pithy little things that she was saying. And then we were getting all of this like philosophizing in her inner monologue and watching her just be stupid. And so I was like, stop preaching at me, girl, and you go do something smart. There's also a way that internal monologue felt like, I don't know, made her feel older or made this book feel dated. There was something tonally wrong about this book and the narrative voice. I liked the idea of the setting about divinity as a city in this magical mansion, but I didn't feel like it delivered here, especially with how this was overwritten. It felt like the descriptions didn't have room to land. I could tell you stuff about like the side characters here, but I would be lying if I told you that I remembered any of them. I think she like bangs a couple of dudes while she's living in this place, but you could offer me $1 billion right now to like try and remember what any single side character. There was a lawyer. Oh my God, maybe I could get $1 billion. I feel like there was a lawyer involved. Ultimately, this is higher on my list because it just said so many things to say nothing at all. Number 3 is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I usually don't include rereads in my list, but it has been so long since I read Throne of Glass, and I spent so much time reading it because I was reading it very closely and taking notes for the review video that I did starting off the series where I am exploring Sarah J. Maas in depth, that I had to include it on this list. No, it is not my #1 worst book. If that tells you anything about the rest of this list. This is a new adultish fantasy about an assassin named Selena Sardathian who has been given a chance to earn her freedom after she was captured, competing in some games to be the king's royal assassin. But when she gets to the castle to compete in these games, the other competitors start mysteriously dying, and so she is having to contend with not only the competition itself, but these like darker magical forces that are at play. I spent a lot of my focus of the review video I did talking about this as an example of the magical Negro trope, because I want this project to be not only about like exploring the mechanics of Sarah J. Maas's fiction, but looking at like the larger things that she does wrong. So I wanted to mention that this also has that incredibly problematic trope, but for this list, we'll just focus on how I think this is also a bad book. Selena Sardathian is not a fully realized character. In a lot of ways, When the Moon Hatched, I think, is in direct conversation with this work as sort of like a spiritual predecessor, as so many romantasy works are. And it's funny to see all of the ways that like she overcorrected in When the Moon Hatched by making her this like very bloody, deadly, gory assassin, because Celaena Sardothien is the assassin who has no sense of self-preservation. She's constantly being snuck up on. She often either cheats her way through things or has a lot of external help, or like there are very convenient ways that she just sort of lucks into winning and being the best at things. We are told very repeatedly that she is a certain way, but we are shown none of that. And the disconnect between what we are told and what we are shown makes this a really frustrating read, especially because a lot of what we are told is that she's the best, she's the prettiest, everyone loves her. Even her enemies in this book are like, that Celaena's the best, isn't she? And it's just like, what's happening here? You guys know that I hate Sarah J. Maas's writing. I find her writing so unbearable. It's the em dashes and the ellipses, the forcing of tone, the repetition. Again, it is like this disconnect between how dramatic she wants everything to feel with how fluffy the story actually is. It is very soapy. It is very empty. There are so many stakes introduced that don't actually matter. For so long, people are being killed around the castle, but we gloss over that. We gloss over a lot of the action. A lot of the action is happening in summary, and instead we're like sitting in all of these soapy parts of the story, right? She goes to a dance, she goes to a ball, she wears pretty clothes, and she's learning how to play pool, and we're sitting in all of these soapy things, but the language is very dramatic, and the things we're being told are all of these other like super dramatic things, and that creates, again, a disconnect in the story that I don't find very pleasant to read at all. It is the kind of story where you in fact have to ignore a lot of it in order to enjoy it, or gloss over or jump over so much of it in order to at all find this enjoyable. Her world building is also like either pretty non-existent or very patchy or so heavy-handed in your face, especially with the ways that it is telegraphing how special Celaena is. I found the side characters to also be really flat. The entire dynamic between Chaol and Dorian and Celaena felt really one note. All of the evil people in this work felt really one note. And also, I don't know, did I mention that the brown character from this colonized land, whose people who we mostly see mentioned and referenced are the slaves in the salt mines, is also a mystical minority? Because that happens too. Number 2 is The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon. This is a fantasy romance that is retooled Reylo fan fiction. So we follow Taliesin, Reid, who's fighting in the resistance, and Alaric, Kylo, is on the oppressor's side. And because this is retooled fan fiction, they have to get married. I've talked multiple times this year about how I think publishing is failing these authors whose fan fiction they are acquiring because they see it as an easy way to acquire a title with a built-in audience without realizing and understanding that it is an incredible amount of work to take the IP out of a fan fiction and leave behind a work that is cohesive. And people will be like, oh, but with AU, that is with AU, that is with anything, because with fan fiction, it is absolutely informed by the IP. Even if it changes a lot of the IP, you as a reader are entering via all of the context that you have of the IP, of the characters, if not the world. And to remove that cleanly from a work that never had to do any of that buildup or characterization means that we are being left with incredibly hollow work. And The Hurricane Wars is an amazing example of this. This is a work that, as it pulled out all of its Star Wars bits, just kind of slapped on its own world building that amounted to a lot of giving things proper names and calling it a day. Everything just has a spacey name and it is what it is, and it still didn't care to do much characterization. On top of that, the plot is so meandering. Like, it feels like it doesn't care about the plot, it doesn't care about the world. There was so little foundation, there was so little showing, there was so little care to really think about this work as its own entity. The only thing defining Taliesin and Alaric are their physical attributes, which we hear about quite often, and all of the angst. But it feels like unearned angst because we don't really understand these characters and we don't understand this world apart from the find replace that the author did for the Star Wars terms to just hit us with this barrage of newly invented terms. Taliesin spends all of her time just lamenting her powers and lamenting her circumstance, and Alaric spends all of his time brooding with Taliesin at every inopportune moment, being like, and then he's trying to kill me with his big pouty lips and big face. And we end up again with a dynamic that is enemies to lovers, that is actually not building a meaningful relationship and is just overly relying on repetition. The entire romance feels like we're just kind of constantly ping-ponging. Like it doesn't feel like incremental change. It feels like one moment she just decides that he's all right and he's kind of cute, and then the next moment she realizes that this man like is her oppressor, and then we just keep going back and forth. And there's so many like really overwrought tropey moments of like, but I hate him, but so why does he make me feel this way? In no interesting ways, with characters I did not care about. And the writing itself is like really overdramatic and melodramatic, and I want to be like, Thea, give me those adjectives right now. No more adjectives for you. You put the adjectives down. Her sentences become so bloated that it starts veering off into this territory where you're losing meaning, right? You're trying to be so melodramatic and to evoke so many emotions or so much grandeur that you're just like not saying anything anymore. And when you couple that writing style with the weak attempt at world building, there were so many like weird little things that it was trying to make happen in terms of like the language that it was using that made it kind of funny. And when I was laughing, and I don't think I was supposed to be laughing. And number one, the worst book that I read in 2024 is To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods by Molly X. Chang. This is a science fantasy novel that blends alternate history romance with a colonized fantasy land. Our main character, Ru has death magic, and she is manipulated by the Roman prince Antony into becoming his assassin in order to keep her family safe. I hated every moment of reading this book. This is another example on this list of a book that really needed some editing down to the word choice. There were so many things here that were awkwardly phrased or descriptions that made no sense. Again, it was attempting to be really descriptive and flowery and veers off into that territory where the description the author has given is actually contradictory or makes no sense. There's something about the writing that feels like sort of overwrought, overblown. It is really interesting because the like overwrought, overblown style of the writing carries over even into the dialogue. There was a whole thing about whether or not this book was a colonizer romance. And I land on the side that, yeah, it is. Not in the sense that this ends on like a happily ever after, or that we know that these two characters end up forever throughout the series, but that this book specifically, the thing that it is doing primarily throughout the book, and it is like the focus of the book, and while other things are happening in the plot, it is the thing that it cares most about in this book, is romanticizing this relationship between the colonizer and Ru. It is done in a way where if the point was to like explore a toxic relationship or to explore how Ru was manipulated, that it did that effectively, because we get the setup of this book and then it time jumps into like 6 months later where she's killed a bunch of people, and we can already tell that she is having more positive feelings about Antony. And we don't know why or how any of that built, because it wasn't interested in showing us that progression or building any of that. What it wanted to do was the villain romance. It wanted to be in the middle of the romance while this man was still a villain. And that is what it gave us. And in a way that I think undermined the character, for her to be so invested in her family, in her world, in her land, in her people, and then to kind of just like very easily go over that, or at least only pay lip service to the conflict that she is feeling, but in action and experience for us, the reader, to watch her just sort of like sail over this time and then be feeling more positively about her colonizer, like her violent colonizer. She has firsthand intimate knowledge of the way that the Romans are impacting her people or are keeping her people oppressed. And sure, he is lying to her in a lot of ways, or trying to manipulate her, or trying to convince her that he has like people's best interest at heart. But again, we don't get to see enough about how that interacts with her lived experience, and it feels like her own sense of guilt or her own sense of like loving her family and her people takes a back seat, because again, the thing that this wants to do is prioritize that relationship and to give us all of the tropes of that relationship of like, my body is saying yes, my mind is saying no, and every time he's around, her heart is beating, and she's going to describe his jade eyes 50 million billion times. It felt like I was having this like very disconnected experience where I was seeing things on page like human experimentation, that it doesn't just happen as a reveal at the end of the book, but that we get told in so many words, and that is also implicated in the things that are happening in this land. That is from go that we see that happening. So the reveal is like less of a reveal than a confirmation of the things we've been shown and told. So I'm like experiencing that. I'm seeing that. But the dialogue is like, and I would die for you, and I would choose death every time. And it's just like, none of this is earned. None of this is earned. None of this is fun for me. Like, I don't find the idea of falling in love with the guy doing the human experimentation fun, personally. And also, you did it badly. You skipped over any of the bits that would like show why this would happen in the first place, because all it wanted to do was the jade green eyes and the melodramatic dialogue and the heart beating whenever they were close to each other. Oh, and the only one bed. I found the world building so incredibly confusing. And then when I was finally like, okay, alternate history, Romans, sci-fi, holes in the sky, colonized land, whatever it is, what it is. From there, I felt like all of the execution was just so clunky. We hear a lot about like Ru Ying's death magic and other types of magic that have existed within her people, but the mechanics of it are like never really explained. And there's supposed to be this thing sort of hanging over the entire story that the more she uses her magic, the worse it is for her. But that feels like kind of forgotten by the story in instances. It doesn't feel like an actual stake hanging over the story because the execution is so patchy and because it is so uninteresting in the larger world and politics that it is using, or the actual real world historical things that it is pulling from. It felt like all of these politics were oversimplified. It felt like this book did not have a great sense of like what about it was interesting. We would rush through things that we actually needed to know, or we would rush through things that were like actually interesting, and we would just sort of linger and sit in these things that were definitely not interested, like another speech. It felt like all of these pieces of plot or politics or side characters didn't feel fully realized. Everything just felt like it was in service of Antony and Ru Ying. It felt like everything was doing what it needed to do in the moment to serve that narrative. I've complained about this specific thing with a number of these titles, right? That it's sort of like uninterested in its larger world or politics or in building out fully fleshed characters in order to serve just like a tropey romance. And that felt true here, but it feels worse here. One, because I would argue that the writing here is some of the worst on this list, and two, because the things that it was bringing up about colonial violence and human experimentation and drug addiction felt so weighty, and the way that it was treated by the narrative and deprioritized by the narrative, it was not fun, it was not interesting, it was not enjoyable, making this the worst book that I read in 2024. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat in the comments. I only did 8 titles because I only gave 8 out of 88 books that I read 1 or 2 stars. There are a couple more that are 2.5 stars or like hitting that 3-star, but I still feel pretty bummed about the 3-star experience. And I'll be gathering all of those into my most disappointing reads. And that's going to be a bonus video for my members over on Bindery. Overall, I had a really good reading year. My star rating average was 3.6. 3.5 is like a nice bell curve of reading where I know that I'm like trying new things. I'm finding things I'm really loving, even if I'm having a few experiences that I hated. So I love existing in that like 3.4, 3.5, 3.6 sort of range. And it was nice that this year it tipped a little more positive. I don't really have anything else to say about worst lists or being too negative or whatever. So if you're just going to come and fight with me in the comments, I'm going to fight back. If you're going to be rude to me in the comments about being negative because I talked about books I don't like, I'm going to be rude back. I feel like that is reasonable, and it should be a given for this space that if you are rude to me, I will be rude back to you, okay? Great, that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys soon. What is this book about? Truly, I don't know. This book just left me feeling really, really gross. This is so strange. I'm like literally looking at this description and I'm like, huh?